And good afternoon to everyone, wherever you may be, from Pittsburgh here, where it is snowing again, where it is cold still, and where I am feeling slightly cut off because a major bridge that I usually use 3 or 4 times a day has just collapsed. So here I am in glorious, frozen, snowed-in, bridgeless isolation, greeting you and hoping that wherever you are, it's a lot better than it is here. We can only, the only good thing is it looks very pretty, but my age, looking pretty isn't enough. I want it to be warm, dry, easy to drive through, and with bridges that work. However, anyway, wherever you are, I hope you're having a delightful and pleasant time. I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks because last week we had my wonderful associate Sharon was interviewing for After Independence, and those of you who managed to tune into tune into the reading of After Independence, thank you for doing so. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a fascinating play. It's a pity we couldn't present it live, but you know, times being what they are and COVID being what it is, we decided to do it as a Zoom. We'll be back to live again with our next one, which will be coming up in 2 or 3 weeks' time. But for those of you who did tune in, thanks for doing so. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a very fascinating, very interesting play with a multitude of questions on identity as much as anything else, not merely possession, but identity. And the big thing, when I first read that script, and the reason I said, yeah, let's have a read of this one, was that simple question in terms of that play: what is an African? Who is an African? We can ask that same question: what is an American? Who is an American? Who is English? Who is Irish? What does it mean? And it struck me back the famous John Fitzgerald Kennedy question. Oh, I know of German Americans and Irish Americans and Spanish Americans. How long does it take before you become an American American? It's a very important question. And what is sad is that we keep debating it generation after generation after generation. So plays like After Independence matter. They matter because they keep that debate going. And who knows, one day we may all realize that we're not that different, no matter where we're from and where we live and who we are. Anyway, 2 or 3 more minutes. Hello, James. Welcome from Crafton. Spring is only 2 months away. I love an optimist. Marlene, hello. The bridge collapse, the president, the snow, the perfect storm. Yes, the president. Dear Uncle Joe is in Pittsburgh today. Talking about infrastructure, which isn't that great. We need it. Hello there, Grace from Dublin, and David there from Stratford upon Avon. Yes, it's all Greek to me, which is, of course, this quote from Shakespeare. Although it wasn't, it's all Greek to me. In Julius Caesar, the line is, it's Greek to me. But everybody feels they need to improve on Shakespeare, don't they? Including me. So wherever those of you in Ireland and those of you in the UK and other places who tune in and listen, because we still have Australia and India and Germany and Poland and various other countries all tuning in, usually on the YouTube channel. Greetings to you all, and I wish it was in the southern hemisphere right now where it might be summer. I can see out of my window the snow gently drifting down. Yes, as we talk today, if you have any questions, put them into the chat, and my dear colleague Catherine will pump them up on my screen so that I can see them. And if you want to make further comment, you can always email us, or either via the YouTube channel or through the website. You can always contact any email. There's the email: marketing@pittheatre.org. Any questions or comments or suggestions of things you'd like us to talk about, let us know. We won't know what you're thinking until you tell us. I have the advantage of talking to you, but I can't hear you. So do send us an email with your ideas, your thoughts, your questions, anything like that, comments, and we'd be delighted to hear them. We will do our best to respond to them as quickly as we can. How are we doing? Oh, o'clock, so we will give a couple of minutes for the latecomers. Hello from frigid Brookline, yes, and hello back from frigid Edward. It's that kind of day, isn't it? It's been like that, and I hear that we are expecting another major storm over the weekend with more snow coming in. Hello, Debbie. I'm hoping by this time next week I'll be greeting you from a snow-free Pittsburgh, but I have a horrible feeling that will not be so. I keep going on about the weather, don't I? I think it's something to do with my age. I keep talking about the weather all the time. I'll drink my coffee and shut up on the topic. How are we doing? We'll give it another minute and then we'll make a start. I'll begin by actually saying the usual thank yous. And I'm extending it slightly because here at PICT we get an awful lot of support from foundations with regard to our education program. The Chotsky Foundation, the Buell Foundation, Pittsburgh Foundation, the Buncher Foundation. I want to thank them all for the money that they give us to help promote the educational aspect of the work that we do. It is so vital. The work is important, and their support is, of course, deeply important because everything that we do costs money. And I also want to say thank you, the Allegheny Foundation, who supported these webinars for the whole of last year. Thank you to them for that. One of the worst aspects, one of the least delightful aspects of my job is that I keep having to go and ask people for money, as you will probably noticed. But every donation really does matter to enable us to, even these webinars once a week cost money. We have to pay for the StreamYard facility, and when we have guests on, we have to pay them, of course. It's my job, so that doesn't cost, but every donation helps, and I'm deeply grateful to the foundations that support our whole education program. If you want to make a donation, you can, of course, visit the website, picttheatre.org, and you can just push the button that says donate, and we'll help you all the way to give us whatever you can. Okay, now, this week, we are going to, hello, Gary, and hello, Rebecca. This week, we're beginning what is basically a 4-part cycle of talks about Greek theatre. And before you throw your hands up in despair, well, you wouldn't do that because you wouldn't have tuned in if you weren't interested. But why is the big question? And I make the point, and it's very simple. And ironically, it's been proven just down the street from me. Nothing survives for long unless it's built on good foundations, and that includes bridges in Pittsburgh. That is as true for theatre as it is for the house you live in or for the bridge that you drive over. Without good foundation, nothing can grow, nothing can develop. So we have to ask ourselves, theatre is an entity that has grown for many, many generations. What is the foundation upon which theatre was built? Where did theatre as we know it in the Western world, and there is that very big distinction, and I'll use that term a few times. Western theatre has a particular line of development, different, although slightly similar, but different in its origins and its construct from theatre in the Far East, from Japanese, from Chinese, from even in India, in Karelia, there's a whole particular ethos of theatre. But when I talk about theatre, I am specifically talking about Western theatre. And so where did theatre in the Western world come from, theatre as we understand it? What were the origins? Who created its form? And the general answer to all those questions is the Greeks. The Greeks laid the foundation of all we now understand as the art of theatre. But if that's true, before we go on to what the Greeks did for us, you have to ask the question, well, where did that come from? Because everything has its foundation. What were the origins of what became Greek theatre that became Western theatre. Where did it all come from? And I mentioned what one might describe as Eastern theatre having a similar background. As with all other forms of human expression, art, whatever its shape, be it oral, be it visual, be it music or whatever, all art tries to understand and explain what the artist sees, what the artist is aware of. Art's function is to understand, to comment, or to interpret, not necessarily and interpret, or interpret, and explain. And even the most primitive of humans made art. They used that. I've mentioned before the concept, the thing of, like 70,000 years ago, a group of guys went out, killed some deer, brought it home. They cooked it with their family, they ate it, and then they probably told the story of the hunt and maybe did a dance or some physical demonstration of the art of hunting. And then we know about it because they painted it on the walls of the cave. So that is, I use that as an example of the very early forms of art demonstrating, interpreting, trying to understand the nature of living. And out of that, storytelling would evolve. The use of a story, the use of words to describe action, to describe events, the building of language. And I think language, to my mind, would build because of a desire to communicate. You need to communicate. Signs and shapes and pictures will do it to a degree, but we develop language. We turn the sounds that we make into recognizable images. Images, a sound image that will provoke a visual image in the imagination. In its original form of storytelling, it was not simply imaginative tales, in other words. It was also a kind of a news roundup. It was what I did today, how I did it, where I did it, and here's my feelings about it. Once you start the news cycle, you then eventually get the pages with the opinion written on them. Anybody who reads the New York Times or any other newspaper knows there's always the news section and the opinion section. And that's how storytelling evolves, by telling a tale and within it making comment and observation and giving opinion. As that progressed, as mankind, or humankind, should I say, in these enlightened days, as humankind developed, it also developed the notion of ideas beyond the actual. Mythology developed. And the possibilities of telling stories that were not about actual events, but about mythological events. In other words, that may have been based on some factual actuality, but eventually would start to evolve themselves into a mythology that was not necessarily factual, but demonstrative of human behavior. One of the earliest that we have is Gilgamesh, which is like over 4,000 years old, written down on tablets that were discovered in a desert. 4,000 years ago, people were creating mythologies, describing the human condition and human behavior as an art form. And mythology and the telling of such stories eventually develop into religion, really. An awful lot of early religion is based on mythological concept, or one attempts to describe and to understand the nature of the world, of what goes on, what is the purpose and meaning of life, those two dreadful questions, as a religious experience based on an imagination. And from that, two things will develop. Once mythology starts to develop religion, two other important factors develop. One is prayer, and the other is poetry. And poetry, I mean, not just simply in the written word, but also in visual, in music, the art of expressing a desire and an understanding for meaning and for interpretation of the world around you, either through a prayer format or a poetic format, and sometimes the two go hand in hand. And as time passes, and as an awareness of the past becomes stronger, that memory, corporate memory, village memory, town memory, city memory, family memory, goes back further and further, and the stories become more extended over a period of time, history is invented. Suddenly, we're not just remembering what we did last week or what we did last year, but what our fathers did, and our grandfathers, and our great-grandfathers, and back and back. And suddenly we now have a category of understanding the world that we call history, a memory of what happened. History, though, is very often tainted by mythology, and it's also exaggerated for the gain of those describing that history. The famous quote, history is always written by the winners. Given any war, it is the winners who write the history of it, and theirs will be considered the truth. And that was true of the Greeks as much as anything else. For many, many years, it was considered that a great epic poem, or two great epic poems, by Homer were mythology, although they've now found that Troy actually existed. But the Trojan Wars and the journey of Ulysses back from it created two immense and glorious pieces of poetic literature written by the winners. And the siege of Troy, the Trojan War, the journey of Ulysses became a foundation of the next development, literature. That we took the stories, we had written poems about the stories, we developed a mythology from the stories, we even grew a religion out of the stories, and we build a literature based on those stories. And that literature in itself becomes a new series of facts upon which our thinking is based. And that leads us to the next great development, which is, of course, once you have a mythology and a religion and a history, and you fight wars and you win them, the next major development is politics. Politics with a big P and politics with a small p. The Greeks developed what we now understand as democracy. It is from the Greek that we get the word democracy. It wasn't democracy as we know it now, because it still included slavery and various other aspects. It was not, it was by no means not even remotely socialist in that sense, but it was democracy in that it depended on election by the voter to create the leader. And it was Pericles of Athens who created this wonderful system whereby every year 100 people had to come together to govern the city, whether they liked it or not, and it was by lottery. They put their hand into a pot, and if the piece of pottery came out with a you're on the council, you were on the council. But it was free, it was democratic, it was not totalitarian. And alongside of that, you had the development of the politic in a small sense, the politic of human nature, of beginning to consider artistically and philosophically, to learn from, to understand from experience of others, from the experience of the past, from the experience of the literature that had developed, from experience of life as it had developed, what is human nature, trying to understand it, trying to explain it, trying to predict it, which brings us back to the poet, back to the writer. And the thinker, the philosopher and the poet really are two sides of a very similar coin in that sense. But the development of the poet is where we begin our journey into modern theatre. The concept of the poet. Now, when I say the poet, don't think of, books of poetry. Think of much more of oratory when it came to the Greeks. The Greeks were lovers of the spoken word. They loved to talk. I mean, if you've actually read anything about ancient Greek philosophy and Plato and Socrates and all of that, the symposium was where it took place. This notion of conversation, of talking, of listening to the use of words, of making words create new thinking. They loved the spoken word. That was a principal method of communication. The fact that Plato wrote down what Socrates said is the only reason we know, because Socrates never wrote anything down. There is that a quote, where is it? To the Greek, the spoken word was a living thing and infinitely preferable to the dead symbols of a written language. And I think through Plato we discover another thing. Socrates himself believed that once something had been written down, it lost its ability for change and growth, which is an interesting concept. That once we turn something from a nebulous idea and a spoken thought, once we write it down, it takes on a kind of absoluteness of its own, which is why, for instance, for generations upon generations, most religious thinking was the spoken word, was passed down father to son, mother to daughter, as a verbal tradition. Once it gets written down, it loses its capacity for being plastic, for being developable or capable of development, and becomes an absolute. So in that sense, Socrates was making that point. What I say is what I'm saying right now. If I write it down, you'll think I'm saying it for all time, which I'm not. So the spoken word was most important. And that's important for the development of theatre. And for these reasons, for this particular reason, for this passion for the spoken word, for talking, this oral tradition of storytelling, of philosophizing, of poetics flourished in Greece. The sheer joy of saying words, of articulating thoughts live through the mouth, together with other people. In other words, in what we would now describe as a theatrical situation. So, as we have said, modern theatre as we know it in the Western world, comes in a large measure from the theatre of ancient Greece. And even on that, we use the Greek technology of proscenium and orchestra and all of those other things. They have the Greeks' classification of theatre genres, even the elements of play structure, even the terms of comedy and tragedy. I'll come to that one in a minute. Come from the Greek. We owe them so much. Now, historically, Greek theatre really began with festivals, particularly one festival. It was the first. The festivals would honor their gods. Again, respect to the mythology / religion. And the particular god was Dionysus, which many people know as the god of wine and jollity and joy and naughtiness. In Athens, they held a particular festival, the city Dionysia. And during this festival, men, always men, used to perform songs to welcome Dionysus. And plays, as we would understand it, would only be presented at the city Dionysia festival. That was it. You did it then. But as the idea grew, as the concept grew and developed, Athens being the main center for all of this, the Athenians began to spread the idea of these festivals and to encourage the same celebration in allied city-states. Greece was not Greece, it was a series of city-states from Athens and Sparta and all the others. But the Athenians encouraged this activity to take place. really in a way to bring all of those city-states on the Greek peninsula together, to give a kind of a common identity. You might say that early theatre was a form of early diplomacy. Those who celebrate the same gods together, those who celebrate in the same fashion, tend to work together. They tend to get closer. So we can thank theatre for modern diplomacy, Greek theatre. And another important point, that at these early Greek festivals, and they did begin to develop into other festivals and worshipping other gods, but at this time, the actors were the dramatists. They were all the one person, because the dramatist was a poet, and they would write a poem and they would perform that poem to an audience. They may have written it down, but they didn't publish it or have thousands of copies distributed. They would stand in a place of performance and they would perform the poem. They would use it because those written down poems were in fact spoken words. The speaking of it was what mattered. And if you're speaking it to a larger and larger crowd, you tend to start to perform it more. You develop a skill base for the performance of that poetry. You start to act. So gradually that increased so that more and more actors could be engaged in the telling of the story. After a while, that was limited. I think there were only three actors allowed in each of the plays, and because these plays also became competitions, who was going to give the better play, who's going to write or perform the best poem at this festival. So you had a competitive sense of it. It was sort of Greece's Got Talent, if you like. Although Simon Cowell is not old enough to have been there, but that concept that the poem was not gone beyond simply being an act of worship to a god, but also a celebration of the art of the word and the art of the performance of the word. So it's growing, it's developing. A new entity is coming into being. And because of the limit of the number of actors that were allowed in these competitions for each of these pieces, the writers, the poets, again, I don't want to use the word writers, they had to write them down, but the poets creating these words started to become inventive. And one of the things that they invented, in order to enable the story to be better told, in order for the narrative to be better told while the tale was being acted out, was the creation of the chorus. And when we look at Greek drama, we are always very conscious of the chorus, and the chorus is always there, commenting upon, bringing the narrative forward. It was a theatrical device. It was possibly the earliest of theatrical devices in the way that we would understand it. So you had this system whereby actors using those words to be the story, while it's being commented on and being narrated and being brought forward by this chorus concept. That was terribly important, especially when you're talking about the huge audiences that would be watching these events, watching these performances. It would be very easy in a very large auditorium with no microphones to actually lose track of what was going on. So the use of narrative chorus became an essential part of the structure of the drama. Even drama is a Greek word. So when did professional actors come into this? When did they realize that it is better that you have people skilled in this particular art of storytelling, of live storytelling? And that the important shift from the simple telling of a tale, which was written as a poem, which was a form of prayer, when did that become a performance entity? According to Aristotle, who tells us many things, the first person to work as a professional actor, there's no absolute evidence of this. It's just what Aristotle says, and there might have been others before him or around the same time. But the first person to appear on stage as an actor, as a professional performer, was Thespis. And he was the first person to appear as a character in a play. In other words, to take on the role of a particular character in the story that was being told, not simply narrating it, not simply saying all the words or sharing them with other members of the team and the chorus, but to actually be the person, to appear to be the person of whom he was speaking. First time, as far as we know, according to Aristotle, that any man did this was Thespis. He's often called the inventor of tragedy, because tragedy was the first form. Now, don't think of tragedy as being sad. Think of tragedy as being what they did to perform the tragedy. Thespis was a singer, and the form of writing called dithyrambs, songs about stories from mythology with choric refrains. So again, it's exactly that same thing. Going back to the mythologies, going back through the histories, telling those stories. But with Thespis, we arrive at the possibility that not merely would he talk about a character from mythology or from history, but portray that character. And so he is the one who's credited with that, with this notion of one person playing a character, playing an individual character. And very often he would, apparently, he would play more than one character, but the differentiation between character was carried out by the use of another expedient that we have inherited from the Greeks, the use of masks. By changing mask, you change face, you change character. Also by changing the nature of your vocalization. But again, it's live, it's word, it's image that you can see. It's not written down on a page. It is the performance that makes it theatre. And of course, the Greek theatre masks are still with us today, 2,500 years later. Anytime you see the two masks of comedy and tragedy always linked together, you know it's theatre. It is the international symbol for theatre, and we have it from the Greeks 2,500 years ago, and from Thespis. Now this, as I say, this style of theatre, this form that we call acting was actually described always as tragedy, Thespis being the most popular exponent of it in his time. So then the competitions moved on from merely being who is the best poet, but who finding the best tragedy. And that became the essence of, or eventually became the essence of the city Dionysia that we understand in Athens. And Thespis, according to Aristotle, won the first documented competition. He was the first prize winner. He was the first one to make the grand final and would go on to be a superstar. Because it was so successful, he also invented another aspect of theatre which many of us dread, depending on the level of support. He invented theatrical touring. He would take his performance and his team with him on a donkey and cart around the city-states of Greece, giving those same performances again. He became, if you like, one of the very first touring actors. Broadway is still following his example. If you can't afford to go and see a show on Broadway, don't worry. Sooner or later, the third cast will visit your city with a slightly downgraded version of it, invented by Thespis of the Greeks. So we have this clear implication that Thespis invented acting as we understand it in the Western world. And because basically prior to him, nobody had ever done that task of assuming characterization. The other homage to Thespis that some of you will obviously have already worked out or know is that in the English-speaking part of the world, one of the names for actors is thespians. This is homage to the first actor, and I like it. So, tragedy. I talked about tragedy. Don't think again of tragedy as being necessarily sad. A tragedy was a play, and it was a play on particular themes, and it was done as homage to the gods. Eventually that expanded out. As philosophy began to influence the poets, they shifted from just doing plays about the gods to doing plays about history, about historical characters and mythological characters. But these plays were also always telling the story, telling the history, that linking together of mythology, religion, history, all together in this one format of storytelling, of live storytelling, to bring the audience into the history, to bring them into the mythology by showing them in a live place those stories being acted out. The Aristotle's Poetics he expounds this very simple explanation about it. These poems written in dithyrambs, songs sung in praise of Dionysius. But it was a poet called Arion, who, I'm checking my notes here, forgive me, Arion, who is credited with taking the dithyramb as a concept of writing into a much more formalized narrative to be sung by a chorus. In other words, the simple thing of telling the story. It's a bit like saying everything's written in a and suddenly expanding that, developing it, doing what a couple of thousand years later Shakespeare did with iambic pentameter, with the use of blank verse, taking what was and turning it into something much more complex, much cleverer, a much better use of the delivery of the spoken word, so that it becomes closer and closer to our ears, to the way we speak. Because that's what an audience want to hear. They want to hear characters speaking their language. Now, these were all amateur actors, by and large. They weren't all like Thespis and actually making a living at it. They would only come together for the festivals. They would only come together for you didn't go to the theater every couple of weeks and see a new show. It was at the festivals, at these competitions. So most of the performers were what we would call amateurs. For them, it was an act of worship or an act of celebration. It was a prayer sometimes. But it was done as a point of dedication. I suppose if you thought of a modern day version of that, it would be the famous Oberammergau performance, 10 hours long, in, is it Switzerland or Austria? But that kind of thing, that they're totally amateur. They come together in there every 10 years to give this presentation of the Passion of Christ. This is what they were doing in the Greek theater. Now, their skill base, we cannot judge. We have no idea. But what we do know is that they tended to use an awful lot of what we might describe as overstated performance. The use of the grand gesture. The grand gesture was there in oratory, and it was there in acting as well. The idea that as you speak, you physically demonstrate the noise you're making, because the person at the back has to be able to see what you're saying as much as because he may not be able to hear it properly. Not in the initial stages anyway. So the use of grand gesture and, as I say, of masks to help tell that story began to evolve. Once the architecture of Greek theater was more clearly defined, once they'd worked out the principle of acoustics, you go to the theaters at Ephesus and various other places, and you actually see how the acoustic was so remarkable in those places. I remember once I was in Cyprus, and with someone, and we came across one of these wonderful Greek amphitheaters on the top of a hill overlooking the sea, and we said, let's try it out. And I sort of stood on the acting area, and the other went up, climbing up and up and up. And for some reason I said out loud, what will I do when I do a speech? And the person up 50 yards away from me said, I can hear you. It's extraordinary how remarkable those early Greek theaters were in terms of an acoustic. But once that happened, the sky's the limit. Yes, the gesture stayed. Yes, the mask stayed, but a greater degree of subtlety could come into it, and a greater complexity in the playwriting. The two masks, the two fundamental masks, were demonstrations of the whole range of potential of masks: the sad face, the happy face, the tragic face, the comic face. But by varying these, and that came all the way down to Commedia dell'arte, and the notion of the use of masks to express emotion on top of the word never really left us. So with all of this happening, the next natural development, which went from initially an act of celebration and prayer to a particular god, opening up to it becoming, and it was as religious as it was artistic. It was as much prayer as poetry. As this began to open up, as the notion of the actor developed, and as the structure of the theater developed, the physical structure of the theater developed, so did the nature of writing. And suddenly we were not simply celebrating Dionysus or any of the other gods. Suddenly we were celebrating humanity as well. Humanity through what we knew as history and mythology, as well as religion. So the later writers began to produce plays rather than simply poems. The notion of the monologue, or the story being told by two or three people, including a narrative chorus, grew and grew until other characters could be introduced and individuality of character began to develop. And that individuality of character gave us that whole spectrum of plays that we now know as the classic Greek theater. And they were writing plays about people. They were no longer just writing plays about gods or mythological characters. They were writing about real people. Now, the people may not have existed, or they may have. Whether Agamemnon existed as we understand him today, or whether he was a compilation of others, whether Oedipus existed or he was a feat of imagination, the reality about them was that they were real. They were real human beings. They were writing about people. They were looking at, just as the earliest things that I described, as storytelling evolved into examinations, evolved into poetry and philosophy. The later writers in the Greek period started reevaluating exactly that. They rediscovered that concept and began to write plays about the human condition. Plays that we would recognize today, and in fact, plays that we still do today. But more importantly, and I'll be talking about this in the fourth of these programs, plays that have influenced modern writers, and by modern, I mean anything from Shakespeare on, plays that have influenced the way we actually look at drama and what we try to do with it when we present theater. It all comes from the Greeks. Now, there were so many Greek poets, stroke playwrights. I found a list recently with at least 100 names in it. Most of them might have written one or two that we have come down to is 2,500 years, and the chaos of Europe in the last 2,500 years hasn't left us an enormous amount, but a sufficient amount of the major writers. Some of those writers for whom we only have one or two plays may have written a lot more. We just don't have them. And an example of that being, on my list of 4, Sophocles. We only have 7 of Sophocles' plays. He apparently wrote anything up to 300, all gone. They were stored in the Library of Alexandria, which was burnt down by some stupid queen. And those of us who care about literature still mourn the loss and are aggrieved at it all these couple of thousand years later. The loss of the Library of Alexandria was the loss of Sophocles. Aeschylus, the great, to my mind, the great heavy tragedian, his plays, particularly the Oresteia, which is his story of, you might describe him as, it's his Homeric story, the story of Agamemnon, the return of Agamemnon, his murder, and the acts of revenge for his murder, is one of the great pillars of Greek drama, because it is not just about historic possibilities, but about the human condition and human behavior, about jealousy, about fear, about rivalry, about lust, all of those things, very human things, not about the gods. The gods step in at the end to solve things, but the writing is about the human condition. I mentioned Sophocles, and again, to my mind, I mean, if somebody said, well, which Greek writer would you preserve? I would say Sophocles. And primarily for 3 of those 7 plays, for the Oedipus cycle. They are remarkable. They are a true examination of the human condition and human behavior. And each of them have a dramatic, remarkable human theme within them. Oedipus himself, Oedipus Rex, of hubris, Oedipus at Colonus, this resignation, this desire to end, this wanting to finish, and Antigone, which may be the greatest of them, this determination not to bow before authority, to fight authority. Now, those, I mean, strangely enough, back in 1916, we did a version of Oedipus Rex, which we did stage purely as a piece of storytelling with a group of actors, just assuming characters back and forth and becoming them the narrative, the overall narrative construct. A couple of years, a year before that, we did a new version. We did a play by a local writer, Lisa Brennan, called For the Tree to Drop, which was the story of Antigone, set in the American Civil War. Totally realistic, totally modern, totally Greek. These plays are so fundamental about the human condition that we have been rewriting them for 2,500 years. And I mean that. And again, in the 4th program, I'll talk about what I mean by that. But that's what they were writing, the human condition. Euripides, another writer of tragedy. By the way, the word tragedy, I must mention, comes from 2 Greek words, one meaning goat and the other meaning song. Or in other words, a tragedy is a goat song. Now, nobody's quite sure where that came from. One theory is that it was the sacrifice of a goat at the beginning of the celebration for Dionysus. So the song of the celebration was preceded by the sacrifice of a goat to the god. So it became the goat song. Another is one of the things that they wore goatskin tunics and what have you. I prefer the idea of this, the idea that it was to celebrate the sacrifice to the god, and this was the goat song, the tragedy. And that's why I say, don't think of it just as being a sad play. It's something more than that. It's deeper than that. It's more fundamental. Anyway, back to Euripides. Again, somebody who was writing plays based on the mythology or the history, depending on which way you looked at it, but not simply dealing with the facts, but dealing with the emotions, dealing with the human condition within that. So you get plays like Medea, who has that hideous choice of leaving, not merely leaving, but killing her own children in order to survive. You have Hippolytus, which is a story of you might say forbidden love. You have Hecuba, and you have the Trojan women, the dilemma. I mean, it's a brilliant concept. You've got plays about the Trojan War, you've got epics about the Trojan War. What about the women? What about the women who did not fight? What about the women who were left behind? What about the women who were sold off as slaves? What was their story? And here you had Euripides dealing not simply with history and mythology, but dealing with the human condition of those who were the victims of war. And the first victims of war are always the women. Iphigenia, the suffering of Iphigenia, the child sacrificed to the gods in order to ensure victory in the war, which is what caused the whole Agamemnon cycle that Aeschylus wrote about. These are plays about human behavior. The Bacchae is about human behavior, about human misbehavior. They're about the human condition. And it's important to recognize that by the time you get to what we know, or most of us know as Greek theatre, these particular four writers, I'll come to the fourth in a second, where it comes from, what were the foundations upon which this was built? And it was built. These wonderful, incredible, timeless plays are built on a foundation that goes back to the most primitive storytelling, primitive art, development of thinking, of mythology, of religion, turning it into poetic expression, building it into an act of worship, which becomes an act of entertainment and education, because each of these great epic poems that were acted out, spoken live, were both to entertain and to educate the audience, and also to comment on the themes that were being examined. They used oratory as a form of examination, as a form of questioning. All of this was the foundation upon which these writers eventually were writing plays, not about the gods, but about the human condition under the gods. The gods were always there. Now, there is one other, because aside from the tragedies, the goat songs, another thing began to develop. Because when you look at the human condition and you examine it in its tragic form, in using the word tragic in its more modern meaning, there is the other side, the absurdity of the human condition, the absurdity of human behavior, the stupidity of it. Every modern comedy, every modern satire, everything from Neil Simon to Monty Python owes its derivation to those Greek writers who could see the absurdity of the human condition and could write comedy. And a comedy is not simply funny, it is also a commentary. It's a commentary just as much as a tragedy is, but looking at it from a more jaundiced perspective, looking at the absurdity of the human condition as opposed to the tragedy of the human condition. And every writer has developed from that. My constant argument being that Shakespeare was one of the truly great exponents of taking tragedy and comedy, like the masks, and marrying them together. So the great, how would the Greeks describe prayer? I think probably in a similar way to the way we would. Supplication and application to a god. Simple as that. And the poetics of drama were as much a supplication and an act of worship and indeed a request as any prayer that you would utter today in whatever your particular faith might be. Anyway, back to Aristophanes. His plays are gloriously funny, and we'll be looking at in more detail at these four writers in program 3. But if you want an example of it, you should read The Clouds. I mean, if you look at the opening scene of The Clouds, where a father is complaining about his son's absurd wastefulness and the cost of keeping him going. In Aristophanes, he's writing about the horses, the passion for horses, but it would be just as appropriate for some not too wealthy middle-class person in California complaining about his son's obsession with surfing. Nothing changes. The human condition doesn't change, as I always say. The only things that change are fashion and technology, and fashion tends to come round. But the human condition and human behavior doesn't. It's only the words that describe it. Horses 2,500 years ago, surfboards and motorbikes today. So Aristophanes is writing comedies not about actual events, not about historical events. He's writing plays about human beings and the absurd ways in which they behave. He's also writing wonderful political satire, Lysistrata or Lysistrata, whichever you prefer. This wonderful play about stopping the women stopping a war by saying, you keep fighting, you don't get sex. Which is a wonderful demonstration of the frailty of men and how far they're prepared to go to make sure they're still enjoying themselves. But this is the genius, the particular genius, and again, genesis of theatre in the Western world, a foundation upon which all else that we have done has been laid. The format, the notion of the actor, the notion of the actor creating characterization, the very shape and format of the performance space, all trace its way back, and we'll talk about this next week, all trace its way back through that line of development that happened from around 600 AD to around 300 AD in ancient Greece, where they just discovered that an act of worship, that an act of celebration could become an act of education and entertainment, and that the poet, whose words were to be heard more than read, the poet could address our condition, us, who we are, what we are, and demonstrate that to us in a format that, as I say, not only educated but entertained. They created something so special and so unique and so remarkable, we're still doing it today. And when we gather together in a theater, whether we sit in front of our TV set, whether we go to the movie house and watch a big movie, it's the same action. The difference being that in theater, we are in the space with the performer. It is a personal one-on-one experience between the person in the audience and the person who will speak. And the most important thing to derive from that, the most important image, the most important thing I can say about that is the Greeks wanted it spoken. They wanted you to hear. They wanted you to watch. They didn't just want you to sit with a book on your lap and read. One of my pet hates, I'll share with you, is people who go to concerts and bring a score with them so they can follow it. Or people who go to plays and bring a script with it so they can follow the script. Stop it. It's an abomination. It's an insult to the art of live performance. Plays are meant to be seen and heard, not read. Music is meant to be watched as it is performed and listened to. Watch the action of the instrumentalist. Watch the passion that goes into the use of that instrument, the bowing of the strings, the fingers on the piano, whatever it is. It's an actual live auditory and visual experience, and the Greeks gave it to us. So, next week, I'm going to talk about Greek theatre in the physical sense. Because theatre is not just simply an action, it is also an entity, it is a thing. A theatre is a thing. And I want to talk a little bit about what the Greek theatre was as a thing and how we have derived from it and how we've seen it. We'll do some pictures of various things, but that's what will happen next week. The following week, we'll talk about some of the playwrights more. And in the final week, we will address the effect of Greek theatre over the last 2,500 years. So, in the meantime, have a wonderful week. Let me just remind you, for those of you in Pittsburgh or visiting Pittsburgh, save the date, because we're having our PICT Gala. Look, there's a lovely picture. Point View Hall at the Carnegie Science Center. It's a gorgeous room. It's got a wonderful view. We're having our gala there on Saturday, March the 19th from 6 to 10 p.m. If you're in Pittsburgh, or if you're coming to Pittsburgh around that time, do come and join us. The tickets are remarkably reasonably priced. You'll find all the information on the website, I think, from next Monday. And I'll be talking about it every week. I want to thank again Allegheny Foundation and all the other foundations and all the donors who help make our education program so successful. And that includes the Expand the Canon series of readings. Please spread the word about the YouTube channel. Tell people that they should sign up. They should subscribe to the YouTube channel. The more subscribers we have, the better. We do have now subscribers all across the globe. But I'd like more. I would love more. Thank you again to all of you who tuned into After Independence. The next play will be coming up fairly soon. Information again will be on the website. And finally, and from the bottom of my heart, because as I keep saying to you, every single dollar counts, please think, when you're on the website, of clicking that button and sending us a donation. It doesn't have to be vast, but the more donations we get, the easier it is for us to operate. And in these times when box office is down all across the world, every donation really does count. Apart from that, have a wonderful week. I hope it doesn't stay cold and freezing where you are, and I hope all your bridges stay intact. Thanks a lot. Bye.